Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Kuf Aleph. Shavua Tov to everyone. We're going to get started with our dedication. Okay. Today's stuff is dedicated by Dai Kusher in honor of her granddaughter Ayala's bat mitzvah, which took place this Shabbat. We learned together long distance online laws of damages and compensation in Parshat Mishpatim, which were developed further in the current Dapim of Bava Kamma. Now at a family reunion, we will celebrate together. Mazal Tov. I hope everybody enjoyed listening to the Parsha in Shul with the great review of even starting with the Avadim and all that we learned in Masechet Kiddushin, and then getting to all the things that we've been learning now about theft, about Shiur, Bor, Eish, all the damages, all sorts of psukim that we've been learning about. It's definitely fun to be in Shul and listen to the Parsha with all that good review of everything we've been learning. It actually raised a question for me that I was wondering about that I'm just going to throw out there, which is when we got to the Geneva psukim, there's all the stuff im b'machtere imatzeh ganav and all that, and that whole sugya, as far as I remember, doesn't appear here at all. It only appears in Sanhedrin. There it comes up because of a whole interesting connection to something else, which I understand there. We'll get there when we get there, why it all appears there, like what kind of Geneva are we talking about? When is it okay to kill a ganav? When is it not okay? It doesn't come up here at all, which is interesting because you would think it would have come up in Bava Kamma, particularly in Meruba when we talked about Geneva. So it's a good question. I don't have an answer to, but it was something I was thinking about yesterday. With that, we're going to get started with our daf. What's great is we don't really have to review the Mishnah because the Gemara does that for us by starting with a Braita that is kind of a reverse order of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah, if you remember, had 3 sections. And we're going to go through 2 of the sections, but in reverse order. We're going to do case 3 and then back to case 2. Not really, this Braita doesn't relate to case 1. Okay, case 1, just so I could review everything, is when you gave wool to someone to a dyer to dye and they burnt it and ruined it. Okay, that was something else. And then they acquire it and they have to return the value of the wool that they received. But now we're going to talk about the other 2 cases, but not with dye and wool, but with wood. Okay, so let's see. You give it to a carpenter. Tanu Rabbanit, top of our daf. Hanoten etzim lacharash la'aseh mehem kisei v'aseh mehem safsal. You give wood to a carpenter to make a chair, and they decide to make a bench instead of a chair. Kind of like dyeing the wool red instead of black. It's still something nice, but it's not what you asked for. Safsal v'aseh mehem kisei, or the reverse. You asked for a bench, you got a chair. Rabbi Meir noten lo demei etzav, right? We're not talking, even though a bench is usually bigger than a chair, obviously he used all the wood or she used all the wood, and therefore it would be, maybe you got a huge chair instead of a smaller bench or something like that. So, or the reverse. So Rabbi Meir says, and this is exactly what Rabbi Meir said in the Mishnah, your view basically, if you did this, you're the carpenter, you're viewed as a thief, which means you acquire the item, you get to keep what you made, and you have to return at the value of when you, so to speak, stole it, which is when you built something else that you weren't asked to build. So, noten lo demei etzav, you have to give the wood back. Rabbi Yehuda omer, im hashevach yeter al yitzia, noten lo et yitzia, im yitzia yeter al hashevach, noten lo et hashevach. You remember we said there were some different interpretations here, but Rashi, we'll go with Rashi. Rashi says, maybe according to the letter of the law, Rabbi Meir is right. But we don't want this person to benefit from the fact that they're now ending up with a nice chair that they built with, let's say you, okay, let's go back to Ruth and Naomi. So Ruth gets the job. She takes Naomi's wood. She creates a really nice chair out of it. And then because she created a chair and not a bench, so according to Rabbi Meir, she gets to keep the chair. And Naomi gets the value of her wood back. So Naomi's left back at square one and with nothing to show for it. And Ruth, who kind of did something not really right, basically ends up with a nice chair. So that seems unfair. And Rabbi Yehuda says we're going to be kones, he says, uses the word knas. We're going to penalize Ruth. She's going to have to return the actual chair that she built. And then the question is really, what does Naomi have to pay? She ended up with a chair that's valued at X, but she really wanted a bench. So she's always going to pay the lower amount because the whole thing is a penalty anyway to Ruth. So she's going to have to pay for Ruth's work and for the fact that now she has a chair. But if Ruth spent more than what it went up in value, then she only gets the value of what it went up. She gets the, right? So again, we went into all the numbers yesterday. I don't need to go through the numbers again, but basically if Ruth's what would normally happen was Ruth's expenses are actually less than the value it went up, then again, she'll always pay the lower amount, which is just the expenses. She'll have to compensate Ruth for her expenses, but Ruth won't get the full value of a chair. Okay, and again, as I said in the beginning, if it's the reverse, then it will be the reverse. Whatever it is, Ruth will get the lower amount, either how much it went up in value or how much Ruth spent. Either which way, it will be the lower of the two. So that's the same in our Mishnah. The Braita organized a little differently, though, because this was our last case in the Mishnah. And now the Braita goes back to case 2 in the Mishnah and says it in the following way. Okay, I see, Caroline, you're asking whether expenses is an important question. I discussed it in yesterday's daf, which is there's a debate whether expenses means the cost of the materials or whether expenses is her labor hours, or perhaps it's a combination of the two. Okay, it's not clear exactly what we mean by it. But again, what I mean when I say it's not clear, it means different commentaries offer different explanations. Umodeh Rabbi Meir. But Rabbi Meir agrees with Rabbi Yehuda that we'll go with this lower amount and that Naomi will actually get back the chair, okay? In which case, im natan etzim lacharash v'asa mehem kisei na'eh v'asa mehem kisei ka'ol sapsal na'eh v'asa sapsal ka'ol. If Naomi asked for a really nice chair and she got not a nice chair, okay, now it's unclear what this means exactly. If you remember with the dye, we talked about that she used the bottom, the dregs that were at the bottom of the caked on dye that was at the bottom of the pot. It didn't come out very good. It wasn't a good dyeing job. Likewise here, did very poor workmanship or something like that. If that's the difference, and not that it was chair to bench or bench to chair, but it was nice chair to not nice chair. Notice, by the way, Ka'or is spelled here with an ayin. On the previous stuff, it was spelled with an aleph. Seemed to be probably just a little bit of lack of clarity of how to spell this word. Different versions. Anyway, so here Rabbi Meir will agree with Rabbi Yehuda that what's the difference here? Well, there's no major change. It's not that Ruth did something different here. It's that she just didn't do a good job. That's different. That's not called a shinoi, which would then make Ruth be able to acquire the item and just return the original value. In this case, she would basically Naomi would definitely get the chair. And it would just be an issue of, then how much Naomi has to pay her. Okay. But according to Rabbi Meir, if it was the other way, we would treat Ruth as a thief, and she would keep the item and she would give back the value from its original thing, right? It's strange, this whole concept. Maybe this is a good time to talk about it. That if it's a thief, Ruth actually ends up winning out, right? And that's kind of what Rabbi Yehuda is disturbed by. But this is all because, again, we have this approach toward thieves that we want to basically help the thief to get back into the society. We view a thief as a troublesome character. And we talked about this before, but I actually saw a Facebook post that I thought was great about someone who, she put up a picture of someone from her store that was stealing. You just saw the person's back and she said, listen, you stole from my store. It's very upsetting to me. Just please bring it back. And I promise whatever's upsetting you and whatever you need, I'll give you a donation. I'll help you get your food. And it was this idea that was so interesting. Number one, it really showed how violated people feel when someone steals from them, which talked about that element. But it also showed how much people want to help thieves. In a sense, we view a thief as a real bad person, but on the other hand, theft often comes from some sort of difficulty and struggle. And as a society, we have to help the thief to get out of that. And I thought it was so well highlighted in that story. It just happened to come up last week on Facebook. And I said, wow, that is such a great, idea about how much we want to help the thief to get back. So because of that, we end up being more lenient with thieves in a sense. And she says, I just want bring back what you stole. I don't want you, she says, I don't want you to go to jail. I won't turn you in. I don't want to do that to you. I want you to get into a better place and I'll help you. So it's an interesting thought that made me think about this whole idea about theft and how we view it and why we're more lenient on the thief. Seems like a strange thing. Okay, now we're going to get into a totally different topic. Again, related to our Mishnah, but I'll read the question, and the way our sugya is going to work today, let's just start with what we did. We had a Mishnah about these 3 different types of cases where the dyer does something, right, with the wool. You gave someone to dye the wool and they do something. Then we brought a brayta that kind of says the same thing, but with a different type case. And now we're going to go back with wood and a chair. Now we're going to go back to the dyeing case. And we're going to basically we're going to have a question and talk about dye in general is something that when you dye wool, I'll read the question, then we'll talk about it, but the structure is going to be like this. We're going to have a question, not exactly clear what the question is. We're going to have, and when I say not exactly clear, really not exactly clear, we're going to have 8 possibilities of what the question is or what the ramifications of the question are, okay? And the first 5 we're going to reject and end up with the last 3. Some of the first 5 are going to sound a little bit absurd. Then we're going to try to answer the question and bring 2 different sources, but not succeed in answering the question. And then as a result of that, and I'm a bet, we're going to get to some contradictory sources that relate to the 2 sources we're going to bring to try to get to an answer to the question. That's the structure for the rest of today's daf. So let's read the question, then we're going to try to understand what the question is. Yesh shevach samemanim al hatzemel, or ein shevach samemanim al hatzemel. When we dye wool, now you end up with wool that looks that seems to be the same. It's the same wool. It's the same amount of wool you had before. It's just a color now instead of being non-colored. Is that valued at a certain? Do we say that was enhanced? That's worth more? Okay, now, of course you might say, of course it's worth more, right? If it's not colored, well, first of all, that's not necessarily true. And what's the relevance of this for our case? So we're going to talk about it. So let's read them and we'll try, as we go through, we'll understand the question. The real issue is here that we have something that's not tangible. Okay, if you take the case we just talked about, a chair and wooden boards are very different from each other, right? There's a clear difference and an obvious increase in value of a chair than wooden boards. Wooden boards aren't usable. Not much anyway. There's not so much you could do with them, whereas a chair you can sit on. But wool, whether it's dyed or not, I'm wearing a gray sweater right now, right? I could have a red sweater. If it was undyed, so I'd have a whitish sweater, right? It might not be exactly white, but theoretically, is it worth more, right? When you go to the store and you pick out a white shirt or you pick out a red shirt, they're usually the same price. We don't charge more for colored clothing. If you think about it, right? If you're wondering, of course it's worth more, but not necessarily. So that's what we're really going to discuss here. But the question is, what's the meaning here? So first they say, what are we talking about? What's the case in which they ask the question, which also really means what's the ramification of this question for our purpose? So as I said, 8 options. Get ready. If we're talking about, we want to know, is there something to samemanim? Are they something actual? Meaning, if I steal how do we get dye? Well, we take a plant, something growing. We crush it up into pieces, right? Like you imagine something like spices. We crush it up into pieces. That's dakinu. Trinu, we soak it in water, and then it becomes dye. And then savabahem, and then we dye with it. So let's go back to Ruth. If Ruth steals Naomi's herbs that were in her garden, and then turns them into samemanim, right, to dye, and colors with them, does she have to pay or not? Do we view that as something real? Now, of course, you say, what do you mean? She stole something. Why wouldn't we make her pay? But if we say that there's really no shevach, there's no added value to the fact that now wool, right? What did Ruth do? She dyed her own wool. Well, if there's no value to that, maybe she's not liable for stealing. But the Gemara says that's a ridiculous question. There's no way they would have asked that question because obviously, first of all, that's a classic case of theft that Ruth did some sort of change on the item. She took herbs, she turned them into dye and then used them, but that's not even so important. But also, obviously, she's going to be liable. She stole something from Naomi. There's no way you would say she's not liable to pay. So option 1 is off the table. To which the Gemara says, Lo tzricha di gazal. Now we're going to neutralize the whole shinoi issue because once there's a shinoi, what does Ruth have to do? She has to pay the value of what it was at the time she stole it. So she'd have to pay for the herbs, and that's obvious. But maybe she stole the samemanim shuliyim b'tzavabe. Now, here's a bit of a strange, this is one of the absurd ones, okay? Now, she basically stole, Naomi had dye already prepared. Ruth stole it and dyed some wool with it, of Ruth's, her own wool. Now, what's the difference if you say yesh shevach or ein shevach? So here goes. My, what's the story? Do we say yesh shevach samanim al gabei hatzemel? If you say that the wool is viewed as, the colored wool is viewed as wool with dye in it, de'amar, so now she could say, Naomi could say, havli simanai deshakaltinu. One second. Give me my samimanim. Right, sorry, I think it's Ruth can say to her. Give me 1 second. It's a very absurd thing, so I always have to remember what this means. Havli samanai deshakaltinu. Right. Odilma ein shavach samanim al gabei hatzemer de'amar leit lach gabai v'lo midi. Right. Ruth can say, let's try the second option first. Ruth can say ein shavach samanim al gabei hatzemer, which means, 1 second, let me go back and make sure I have this right before I say it. Apologies. Right. The first option is just simple. The first option is Naomi says, look, you stole my dye, you dyed your clothes with it, give me back the dye. Okay, that's obvious. Okay, or your wool with it. But perhaps if we say ein shavach samanim, then basically Ruth can say to Naomi, leit lach gabai v'lo midi. She could say, now this is why it's absurd. She can say to Naomi, if you say ein shavach samanim, these samimanim didn't change the value of the wool at all. So Ruth could say, I didn't steal anything really, because in the end, I used your dye. I colored, now there's no shinoi, so she didn't acquire it. I used your dye, it's now in my wool, but it didn't make my wool go up in value. So basically it's as if I didn't steal anything. Okay, it's a little absurd to think that she could say this, but that's really what that's what they're claiming. Okay, they're going to reject it in a minute, because of course she can't say that. But what she's saying is if we don't, it's an interesting question if you think about it. If we don't view dye as adding value to wool, then there's really no value to dye. In which case, if you steal something with no value, you don't have to return it. There's some logic to that. But the Gemara is going to say, what are you talking about, Amre? V'i ein sheva. You could say, if there's no shevach samanim al gabei hatzemer, even if the dye doesn't add value to the wool, Ruth still can't say to Naomi, nothing happened here. I didn't steal anything, right? I don't have anything of yours here because your dye is now absorbed into my wool and didn't really add any value. Naomi can still say, but I had a pot full of dye in my house and it's not here anymore. So I don't care that your wool isn't worth anything. You obviously owe me that pot of dye. Okay, so that's the explanation, the second rejection of the second option. There's no way you could say that. Okay, let's try this one. Maybe you could say it like this. Now, until now, I just want to point out a minor change between the first two and the second two. In the first two, yesh shevach meant if there's added value, then Ruth will have to pay more, right? Because she'll obviously, right? And the option of ein shevach meant she's exempt because it didn't add any value, so perhaps she wouldn't have to pay anything. In the next two versions, it's going to be flipped. Yesh shevach is going to actually mean that she is exempt, okay? Or perhaps doesn't have to pay any more. And ein shevach is going to mean she actually has to pay more. So it's just a matter of, it's just interesting to see how they could take the same words and kind of flip the meaning, depending on what you think the question is. Let's explain it this way. Well, if there's no shevach on the tzemer, now what did we just say? If the wool this goes back to the previous explanation. If the wool has no added value, we're now explaining ein shevach. If you didn't add anything to the wool, Ruth can't say, well, here, there's shevach in this wool, and basically we tried to say that Ruth was going to say, I don't owe you anything, to which we said, there's no way that she could claim I don't owe you anything because she stole Naomi's dye. So if you say ein shevach samanim al gabei hatzemer, that the wool didn't go up in value, well, then it would be obvious that Ruth would have to pay Naomi the value of what she stole, because even if the wool didn't go up in value, she still stole samimanim and the dye, and she would have to return the dye that she stole. So that's ein shevach. Now, it's not so clear where they're going with this till you see the other side. O Dilma, yesh shevach samanim al gabei hatzemel. Now, again, this is going to sound absurd, but if there's shevach samimanim, which means, okay, let's just think about it like this. Dyed wool is made up of wool and dye, okay, which are two separate things that are now combined, but there's independent value to each. So if we view it like that, Amar Le and Ruth could say to Naomi, well, since dyed wool is dye with wool, so here, you want your dye back? Go take it out of my wool, which is obviously ridiculous because you can't really take the dye out of wool. But basically, what she's saying is, the whole is the sum of two parts. This is dyed wool. So you want your dye back? Okay, I don't have to pay you the value. I could just give you, and that's why the yesh shevach is actually the more lenient option for Ruth, because Ruth could say, here, just take my dyed wool and get your dye out of it and give me back my wool. So the Gemara says, Shaklinu, what are you talking about? How could you get the dye out? Now, what they were thinking when they said this wasn't so absurd. What they were thinking is, if you remember, we learned this before, that there's dye that you can remove. If you remember, al yidei tzfon. Tzfon is a kind of soap or cleanser that they would use to remove dye from wool. So they say, wait, so Ruth, theoretically, what they're saying is, okay, Ruth can say to Naomi, here, go use tzfon, clean out the dye and take the actual dye and give me back my wool and go for it. You want your dye back? That's how you're going to get it back, which is the easy way out for Ruth. She doesn't have to pay out of pocket anything. But they say, but my shaklei b'tzfon, what? You think you're going to take it out with this tzfon material? Tzfon abuche me'aber hashava lo avid. Tzfon removes the dye from the wool, that the wool will go back to being what it was. But imagine, right, when you wash something, you don't end up with a pile of the dirt that you took out of it, right? You don't end up with the dye in a vessel that you could say, okay, here's your dye back, right? You wash it out, it gets mixed up with the water and the soap, and it's obviously not usable anymore. So that's not a good option of what the question was. That doesn't work either. Like I said, it's back to being an absurd question. Option number 4. Okay, until now we thought that Ruth had just stole dye. First, we thought she just stole herbs and turned them into dye. So it can't be that. Then we thought she stole dye that was already prepared. We said, and then again, what the question was, we came up with different options. We can't explain it that way. So let's try this. She stole from Naomi. Ruth stole dye and wool and dyed them together. Here you can already see a question coming, because here, she stole the dye and the wool from the same person. And now she put the two together, dyed the wool with the color. And now the question is, can she just return the dyed wool? Now here is already back to, is the whole equal to the sum of its parts? Is dyed wool considered like she returned her the dye and the wool? Now it all has to do with whether you say there's shevach samimanim or not, or at least we think. Then we're going to say there's a problem with this, but because we're still on number 4, I told you only once we get to number 5 are we going to start accepting the answers. Do we say yesh shevach samimanim al gabei hatzemel? This increased the value of the wool, which means kamma hadran samimanim b'tzemer. So when you return, let's say wool is worth 100, dye is worth 10. And wool that's dyed is worth 115. So when she returns, or it could be even worth 110, either which way, when she gets it back, Naomi, she gets back exactly what was stolen from her in terms of value. So that's if we hold yesh shevach samimanim. But therefore, right, she's returning samimanim and wool just mixed together. Oh, Dilma, or perhaps, ain't shevach samimanim al gabei tzemer. Perhaps we say because it's not tangible, and because maybe people don't care whether it's colored or not colored, maybe there's really no increased value. And therefore, when she gets her wool back, her colored or dyed wool, really what Naomi gets is just semer mahadrele. She's really just giving her wool. Samimanim lo mahadrele, but she's not giving her back the dye because it's not really worth anymore. Again, it all depends whether you view, again, it's a matter of, because it's intangible, do we view it as added benefit or not? So now they say, what are you talking about? But we all know that it's worth more now, even though I told you a white shirt and a red shirt might not cost more nowadays. in those days, it for sure cost more. Dyed wool was worth more. So if that's the case, right, even white, by the way, would have to be, right, white wool. Again, it's not a clean white. You'd have to still do a process to it to get it to be really white. So maybe white isn't a good example, but either which way, the point is, in their day, it was worth more. So they say, you can't possibly say it's not worth more. So of course, Naomi's getting back her value. And of course, Ruth doesn't have to add anything. This isn't even a question. To which answer number 5 is going to be based on number 4, but with a minor detail of difference. Lo tzricha dizal tziva. The case is this. Ruth steals the wool of Naomi and the dye, and she dyes the wool. And then let's say some time passes, and let's say it was 100 of the wool, 10 of the dye, and let's say it's worth 115. It goes up a little in value. But then something happens, and the prices drop. And this wool that's dyed is now worth only 105. And then she goes and returns it to Naomi when it's worth 105. Colored wool went down in value. Okay, it was out of style, right? We all know there's fads, there's styles. It was out of style. Now she only gave back Naomi 105. So it depends how you view it. Okay, if you say yesh shevach, right? So now you would say, if you say yesh shevach would be, right? You have to think about how to read this, but I guess ein shevach means if there isn't added value, meaning if it goes down in value, then Ruth would have to pay the extra. Okay, she would have to pay the extra 5 after giving back the wool with the dye. And according to yesh shevach, he would say, no, this is worth more, even though it went down in value. I guess that's how you would see it. Unclear exactly which side would go where the truth is, but that's basically the question. Does Ruth have to add the added 5 or not? Option number 6. Ibait ema, kigon ditzava. Did I say there were 8? I think there's only 7. Maybe I miscounted somewhere. Okay. Anyway, I have to go back and look. If I said 8, if I counted wrong, I counted wrong. 1, 2. I thought I numbered them. Maybe I only got to 7. Okay, let's keep reading. Ibait ema. Let me just look here for a second. There's also a nice chart in the 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 7, not 8. My mistake. Okay. Ibait ema. Kigon tetzava behu kofa. Okay, there's a big machloka what a kofa is. Some people say a kofa is a monkey. Some people say a kofa is like a kupa with a hay, even though it has an olive here, but that often happens. And it's a basket. Okay, let's talk about a basket. If you color a wicker basket, wicker baskets come in colors, they come in not colors. The natural color is also a color. So perhaps it doesn't really increase it in value. So basically, Ruth steals Naomi's summer money, which are worth something, dyes something that doesn't really increase in value by the change in color, or perhaps it's coloring a monkey, okay, which sounds very odd. People do that kind of thing. Well, my husband reminded me, we were talking about it on Shabbat. I didn't remember. I have to go look at my computer and find the pictures of it. It wasn't in my album, which is good proof. If you don't put pictures in your album, you don't remember things anymore. But when we were in Vietnam, we actually went to this hike one day, and there were colored horses that were colored to be like zebras. I have to go see if I can find the picture. But apparently maybe people do this kind of thing. But if you color a monkey, does the monkey go up in value or not? And that's a question, okay? So if it's talking about wool, it's obvious it goes up in value. But if it's a wicker basket or perhaps a monkey, depending on what interpretation you choose, then maybe not. So they don't even go through the options here. It's obvious kind of thing, which is basically if you say, right, again, do you view it as this is a monkey with color on it and that's worth more? So therefore, by returning the monkey, it's fine. Or do you say, no, she took the monkey, she colored it, Ruth, but in the end, Naomi gets back a monkey, but who cares? The monkey is not worth anything different now that it's colored. And therefore, Ruth would have to compensate her for the dye because the dye was basically lost on it. Or again, the wicker basket. Now we're actually going to have a real monkey in option number 7, okay, meaning a definite monkey. In this case, we're not sure it was a monkey, but option number 7 is going to be with a monkey. Ravina Amal. What's the case? Okay, now we're going to take Ruth and Naomi, but Ruth is not in the wrong at all here. Ruth has wool. Naomi has dye. And along comes Ka'ate Kof, a monkey that doesn't belong to anyone, because if it belonged to someone, you can make the owner of the monkey responsible. But the monkey is a hefker monkey wandering around. Okay, if you think this is funny, the Gemara is talking about this. A whole bunch of sugyot you might remember that talk about monkeys doing things. A monkey comes along. I'm not sure. I don't remember now where they come up, whether we've already learned it in this cycle or not, but they definitely come up. A monkey comes. And basically takes the Ruth's wool, takes Naomi's dye and dumps the dye on the wool and colors the wool. Now, do we say, Yesh Shavach Samanim Agabeat Semel? Do we view, again, if we view this as tangible, Naomi now gets something that's worth more, even though it's right, it's intangible, but right, do we count it? In which case, Da'amrle, Ruth, it's Ruth's wool. Ruth now, I got confused for a minute. Ruth has wool that's now worth more. So Da'amrle, Naomi can say, Havli simanai degabach ninu. Naomi can say, look, right, my dye is in your wool, even though I know it's not your fault, Ruth, not like all the other cases where it was her fault. I know it's not your fault, but you now have something worth more. Give it back to me. Or do we say there is no shevach of samanim on wool? And Ruth says, I don't have anything of yours. I just have wool. It happens to be colored right now. But that's not something real. That's not something you can feel, right? It's not something you can touch. Therefore, no. Okay. It does sound like out of a curious George or caps for sale or something like that. So proof that the rabbis thought about those things as well. Okay, so there we have our question, okay? 7 possibilities about what the question is. Sorry, I said 8 before. 7 possibilities. Again, the first 4 are rejected. The last 3 are accepted. And now we want to come up with an answer. So the question really is color meaningful, right? Okay, don't ask this question to an artist, right? They'll be horrified. Of course, color means something. Of course, color is significant. But that's really what they were struggling with because it just looks different, but it's really the same object. And it's really the same thing. And is this really value? Is it not value? How do we grapple with it? So they're going to bring 2 sources. One from the world of orla, which are the first 3 years of the fruits that grow on a tree that you plant. You can't benefit from them. So now we're going to see Tashma. Look at this Mishnah. If you dye a garment with peels of an orla fruit, which are generally forbidden to be used, but now you have this object that's dyed with the peels of an orla fruit. So if you view that as significant, then you're going to have to burn it because it's forbidden to benefit from. And in fact, the Mishnah says yidalek. So what do you see here? Alma chaduta milti, right? Color obviously is significant because it's only the color of the shirt that came from the orla. Obviously, it's significant. To which I'm a Rava, no. This is a special, unique halacha by orla. The Torah forbade even benefit that's just in things that you can see, but not that you can feel or touch or have a better sense of. Tanya, how do we know this? Because of a drasha from the pasuk. This is learned out directly from the verse about orla, and it's unique halacha by orla. Arilim lo yachel, you can't eat arilim. So there it says only food. The Braita says ein li ela isur achila. That would only mean eating because it says don't eat. Minayin shelo yehendem mimenu. How do you know you can't benefit from it? V'lo yitzbabo, and you can't color with it. V'lo yadlik bo ataner, you can't light a fire with it. Talmud lomar varaltem orla toet priyo arilim lo yachel. The word orla there appears 3 times. That comes to include all sorts of other uses of it, not just, which includes coloring. So here you see, right, if you dye with the orla, it's going to be forbidden, but that's unique halacha by orla. Second answer, Tashma, beged shetzva'o b'klipei shviit yidalek. This is a Braita. If you color with, shviit is in the shmita year. You're not allowed to benefit from anything grown in the shmita year. So now it has kedushat shviit. So what does it mean? It means you can eat it, but you can't use it for atypical uses. So how do you know that that clothing that was dyed with peels from shmita produce, yidalek, also gets burned? Same thing. What do you see? It's obviously significant, the dye. The pasuk says the produce should be tihiyeh, it's for you, and you can eat it all, but tihiyeh means it retains its status. So if it was kedusha to eat, let's say, then the peels of it are going to also be kedusha, even if you use them just for dye, which normally isn't considered significant, but we're going to consider it significant for the purposes of shmita. So we try to bring 2 answers from orla and shmita. doesn't work because they say those are unique halachot. And also, by the way, those are halachot in the world of Isser and Heter, not in the world of Mamonot, right? Mamonot is monetary. Who does this belong to? That's a whole different world than things that are forbidden between, right? Because God commanded them, God and man, and not, or God and women, but not, and right, not between two humans. So can't learn from there, and we end up without an answer to this complicated question. Okay, so we had the question, 7 attempts to try to understand what the question was, and then 2 attempts to answer the question. No answers are successful, and we move on. But we're going to move on within the 2 things that we brought. We're now going to bring, to finish off today's stuff, 2, right now starting Amud Bet, but it's a short Amud, 2 contradictions that Rava is going to bring, one relating to orla directly with the Mishnah we quoted, and one relating to kedushat shviit, relating to dyeing, okay? Dyes and plants that have dye in them, and do they have kedushat shviit? We'll talk about that soon. So what Rava's is a little more directly, the first contradiction is a little more directly related to the source we saw. The second one's a little less directly, it's a little more tangent, but it does have to do with our topic of dyes. Rava Rami, so Rava brings the following contradiction. Tnan, the Mishnah we just saw, Beged shetzva'o b'klipei orla yidalek. Alma chazuta milti. This again gets back to our issue. This shows you, now here, when Rava brings this contradiction, he doesn't seem to think this is only by orla, because he's now going to compare it to something else, not monetary law, but within the world of isur veheter, actually tum and tara, things that are impure. And he's going to assume that the same principle applies, raise a contradiction, and then resolve it. So it seems like the way something looks is relevant, because here you have just the change in color, and that's already going to make it forbidden. Uriminu. This contradicts the following source. A Mishnah in Ohelo, which talks about Dinei Ohel, which is if you have, part of a dead body or a whole dead body, or even a reveat of blood. Okay, that's a quarter log of blood from a dead body in a house. All the vessels in the house will become impure. So the Ohel, because it covers it, right? Everything's in one covered space. So whether it's in a house or whether it's in a tent. So the Mishnah says, Revi dam shenivala bebayit. Now, what's the issue? Their houses were made, the floor was made of dirt. It wasn't like marble floors or tiled floors or anything like that. So what if the blood gets absorbed in the ground? Well, habayit tameh. So the house is impure because it's got a reveat of blood impure. So anything in the house is impure. Some people say, though, habayit tahol. The house is pure. So how do we reconcile this? This has nothing to do yet with our topic. Below pligi, the Gemara stops the Mishnah and explains, by the way, this is not a difficulty. This is not a machloket. It's not a disagreement. If you have a reveat of blood before it got absorbed in the ground, and there were vessels in the house before it got absorbed into the ground, any vessels in the house would actually be impure. But once it gets absorbed in the ground and then you bring new vessels into the house, those vessels will not be impure because it's already absorbed in the ground. And even though it was a reveat, it doesn't matter anymore. It's absorbed in the ground. It's as if it's not there. That's not important yet. Niv ala biksut, but they're going to foil that with a different case. If it was absorbed into a shirt, let's say, or a blanket or a sheet or whatever it is in your house, it gets absorbed a reveat of blood. Now, that stays in your house and new vessels come in. Is that going to be like getting absorbed in the ground or not? We're going to see it's not the same because absorbed in the ground kind of just gets lost. But absorbed in a shirt or sheet is a different story. So now we have a different way of assessing. Well, it's an interesting assessment, and it goes back to what we talked about, getting rid of the dye in the wool and how difficult that is. Well, they're going to suggest a certain test, which I wonder exactly how you do this. But im mitkabeset taksut v'yotzei mimenu revi'itam tme'ah v'im lav Torah. You do an experiment. You wash it. Okay, so I would assume what you have to do is you measure the amount of water that you're rinsing it in. You rinse out the shirt. Let's say it's a shirt. You soak the shirt in the water. If now you have whatever amount you had plus a reveat of the blood that came out mixed up, and so if you now measure and you get to, let's say it was a log, and you now have a log and a quarter of liquid, which includes the blood and the water, then if there's a revitam that is able to come out of that shirt that was absorbed but can now come out, then that shirt caused everything in the house to become impure. But if less comes out, meaning you could have had a reveat that went into that shirt, but if you could only get out of it when you rinse it less than the reveat, because we all know not all the blood is going to come out. Some is going to stay in there and get stained. It's impossible. near impossible to get it all out. So if you can't get it all out and you end up with less than the revit that comes out of the shirt, then the house is tahor. Okay, the vessels in the house are pure. So what do you see here? In the case that we say it's pure and we don't consider it significant, is there a blood stain on the shirt? Do you see it red? Yes, you do. That less than a quarter log is basically going to be noticeable. It's going to be red. You're going to see a blood spot, and yet we don't consider it significant unless, right, a revit of it can come out. So you see here that color doesn't matter. So, because again, it had a revit in it. It's just that we only care how much can come out. But that's weird, because if we said by orla, what is noticed matters, and here we seem to say what's noticed doesn't matter. The color doesn't count. So Amar Rav Kahana, don't ask a question from there. Mikule revit shanukan. This is talking about the kulas of revit, meaning this is a leniency, but why? Because the blood we're talking about, bidam tfusa de Rabbanit. We're talking about rabbinic blood here. We're not talking about blood that's forbidden by Torah law. This mission is referring to dam tfusa. What is dam tfusa? Bit of a machloket, but what it basically means is it's the first blood that comes out of a person when they die. Now, when the first blood comes out of the person, it's not clear they're dead yet. So it might not be blood coming from a dead body. The way Rashi explains it, again, there's a bit of a different explanations about it, but Rashi says, right? It's just when the person's on the verge of life and death, a quarter log of blood comes out, but we're not sure whether the blood came, right? Some of it probably came when the person was still alive, which means it's not blood that causes impurity of blood from a dead body in a house. So it's suffix blood, which the rabbis were strict about, but because it was just a rabbinic strictness, we can be lenient about it when it comes to the halacha. So this doesn't teach you anything about Torah law, about whether something that looks colored counts as colored or not. So again, it was just a direct contradiction for the orla. So we already said perhaps in monetary law, things are different. Okay, second contradiction. Rava Ram, Tnan. Mimin tzovim, svichei stim vekotze, yesh lahen shviit ulidmehem shviit, yesh lahen biur ulidmehem biur. These are laws about shmita. There's two basic laws. One is that all the things that grow, even if you didn't plant them in the shmita year, but they grew wild, that's called svichin, that they just mentioned here, svichei. We're now talking about stim and kotza. Stim it's called woad, W-O-A-D, according to the Koran, and it creates an indigo dye. And kotzeh, according to the Koran, is safflower, and it creates a yellow dye. So these are two different herbs that you would, or grow, things growing that you would find that you would turn them into, and they grew in the Shemitah year. So the question is, do they have kedushat shviit? Do they have sanctity that you can't use them for atypical uses and other things? Number two, does it have also laws of biur, which is the same. If it's shmita, it's kedushat shviit, then you can't, once there's no longer in the fields, you have to get rid of everything you have in your house, because it has to be for you and your animals. And once it's no longer there for your animals, you have to get rid of it in your house. So they say here, according to this Mishnah, yeah, even though they're dyes and you don't eat them, because usually shmita, we're talking about produce that you can eat, usually has a kedushat shviit to it. And this also has all the laws of shmita. Urimini, this contradicts the following source. Alei kanim, if you take leaves from reeds, va'alei fanim, and grape leaves. Okay, grape leaves we know we eat. I didn't know that there's reed leaves that people eat, but apparently you could eat them also. Grape leaves you could eat or not. Okay, not everybody eats grape leaves, and not all grape leaves are meant to be eaten. So if you have these leaves, and what did you do? Givevan becheva al pnei hasadeh. You made a storage area in the field, which basically means you made a pile. You covered it with a lot of hay, and that was a way people would use to protect their items through the winter. They didn't have, let's say, a storage house. Liktan la'achila. So now the question is, do they have kedushat shviit or not? So if you gather them for the purpose, and here comes in your machshava, what you intended. If you did it for achila, for eating purposes, yesh ben kedushat shviit, then they have sanctity of the shmita year. Le'etzim, but if you collected them to use for wood, for basically, these leaves can dry out, and then you'll make fires out of them. Well, and cook with them, ein behem mishum kedushat shviit. So what do you see here? If it's not meant for food, it doesn't have shmita, the laws of shmita. So if you collected the herbs to make dye out of them, they shouldn't have kedushat shviit. So we seem to have a contradiction, because we assume right now there's two options, eating and not eating, and both those go in the non-eating category. To answer this contradiction, we're going to split it up and say there's actually three things. And really, the dyeing is going to go closer to the food. And why is that? Or it's going to be actually like the food. There's going to be two categories, but basically these three categories, which we're going to, instead of putting the dye in the category of non-edible items, we're going to put it with food for the laws of shmita. And why is that? Well, Amar kra le'ochla. The Torah said that shmita produce you can eat, right? You can't do business dealings with it, right? And you can't use it for other kind of things, but you can use it to eat. And for what? What does eating mean? What happens when you eat? When you eat, hana'ato u'bi'uro shavim. When you enjoy it, it's exactly when you're destroying it, which is just like the samamanim. When you destroy them, that's when they actually color, right? That's the destruction of them is the coloring of it, because then they're no longer in existence. Yatzu eitzim, but eitzim are different, because hana'atan achar bi'ulan. What happens with wood? Really, most wood you don't use. Now we're going to talk about this in a minute. But you don't use so much for a candle or for warming yourself, which would be immediate use. Right? As it's being destroyed, it's being helpful. But really, you use it for coals. Now, once the coals are created, there's no more wood anymore. It's not wood anymore. It turns into a coal. So the hana'atan is achar bi'ulan. After they're destroyed, that's when you start to benefit from them, when you cook your food on it on the coals. So that's why eitzim is on one hand and food and dyeing are on the other. And that's how we explain this contradiction. So one last question. Eitzim de mashchan, which there's a whole debate whether this is a unique type of wood or it just means any wood that you use to light a flame, either to warm yourself or for light. There are cases where it happens all at the same time. So why isn't the would have kedushat shviit in that case? Rava says because most wood is used for burning for coals and not for all these other uses, and therefore we go by the majority. Okay, so what we did today, we started with a braita that was basically parallel to the Mishnah, just a different case. Instead of dyeing, was about wood and making a chair, which we thought was one and the same. Although with the next question, we learned that maybe it's totally different because dyeing is perhaps viewed differently, and that's the whole question: is there shevach in dyeing or not? Do we really see an increase in value or not? And then what are the ramifications of that? Right? We had 7 different options of coming up with what the question was. 2 possibilities to answer the question, neither was good. Then Rava brought 2 contradictions based on those 2 sources, or at least the concept that comes out in those 2 sources, and we resolved the contradictions. With that, we finish for today, wishing everybody a Shavua Tov and Besorot Tovot.